Hello and welcome to Season 4, Episode 6 of the Virtual Coffee Podcast. I'm Bekah, and this is a podcast that features members of the Virtual Coffee community. Virtual Coffee is an intimate group of developers at all stages of their coding journey, and they're here on this podcast sharing their stories and what they've learned. And we're here to share it with you. Here with me today is my co-host, Dan.
Thanks, Bekah. Today we talk with Bryan Heeley. Along with being one of the original members of Virtual Coffee, Bryan is an entrepreneur, tech leader, data scientist, machine learning engineer, and business developer. He's helped create or grow several startups, raised money, and built and managed teams of varying sizes, small to large. He's currently CTO of a fintech company he co-founded called Era. Bryan has had a long and interesting career, and he's been in a lot of different roles. He's being hired as an engineer, hiring and managing others, and founding entirely new companies. His experiences have given him a unique approach to decision-making that he was kind enough to sit down and share with us.
We start every episode of the podcast like we start every Virtual Coffee. We introduce ourselves with our name, where we're from, what we do, and a random check-in question. We hope you enjoy this episode. Today's random check-in question is, if it were possible, would you live on the moon? I'm Bekah. I'm a front-end developer from a small town in Ohio, and I would not live on the moon. I feel like there are plenty of spaces in the Earth that we have not explored yet, and so I would like to start there.
Like what?
The deep sea,
bottom of the ocean. Okay, yeah,
where the aliens live.
Hi, I'm Dan. I live in Cleveland. I do development of many kinds, I suppose. And yeah, I don't like the moon as it exists right now. Seems pretty,
Boring,
yeah. Empty, and all that stuff, right? But I've read like a number of different books that are set sort of in the future where the moon is, populated to different levels or whatever, so I would consider it in those cases. It depends on, like what they got going on there, Do they have if they have like movie theaters and, restaurants and stuff, if it's like that kind of thing, then yeah. But if it's just like all just like tents and science people, then that's less interesting to me too,
people.
I like it. But I do like exploring like, new areas and hiking and stuff. So that could be cool. Plus the jumping.
That would
always
be
looks
fun.
always looks fun.
Very excited. My vertical would increase. I really think so.
Yeah, I would hope so.
Quite a bit, yeah. Cool. I'm Bryan Heeley. I'm an entrepreneur in Boston, Mass. And I currently am a co-founder, CTO of a company called Era. And as for the moon, I'm going to go with probably no. I'm in the same camp as Dan. Like if it's like well built out, like we're talking future moon with like colonies and like tons of stuff, then okay, maybe. But even then, I feel like if I have my option, I'd prefer like Mars or like
Mars. Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe the question should have been like outer space.
Outer
somewhere.
space, absolutely.
Space
yeah, without
cowboy.
question. Yeah, we're going somewhere.
Why is Mars better than the moon?
Just slightly more stuff. Like it like probably had water at one point that they wanted to investigate. It's got a little bit of an atmosphere. It's got mountains and glaciers. Whereas the moon, it's like once you've seen 100 square feet, you're just looking at different types of rocks.
Just different craters. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Welcome, Bryan. We're really, really excited to have you on the podcast today. For those of you who don't know Bryan, he is one of the first people to ever come to Virtual Coffee. And so Bryan has been around a really long time. Because of Bryan, we have a Slack. So you all owe that to Bryan. So this is long overdue, I feel like. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, every day.
So we always start off with kind of your origin story, your background, and hear a little bit about what got you to this place where you are today.
Just generally like my career?
Yeah.
So, I probably had one of the more straightforward career paths in tech. I went to college for computer science right out of high school. I went to Northeastern University here in Boston, studied computer science and jumped right into, working at a startup while I was there. I actually, So the actual path of my career was Northeastern has this sort of 5-year program where you actually do work interspersed with academics. So you do 6 months in school, 6 months on an actual like industry job.
That's cool.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. I didn't even realize how cool it was at the time. I thought it was just like, oh, money, as an older adult, I'm like, yeah, that was a big leg up in terms of like how the future progressed. But so I did 2 like more traditional internships, 6-month internships at Goldman Sachs and W.R. Grace, so fairly largish companies. Then in the intervening period before my third one, I actually started a small startup in my dorm. Ironically, it was kind of a silly thing. It was building a shareable note-taking social network for like other college students. I was trying to actually pitch it Facebook style to like the university would sponsor it and to cover fees and everyone sort of join in. It did okay. It was sort of making a little money, but ultimately I actually kind of got acquired to my second role, which is working another startup in Boston called Garment Ballet, which was sort of this luxury delivery laundry service. And so they had this pitch where they were trying to create like a national brand out of it. And they were going to create like a central tech hub that sort of managed almost like Uber style, like drivers across the country would work for different shops, and it would sort of, work somewhat independently, but centrally managed. And so I joined them as my third internship for graduation. And they just ended up staying there. So I was there for like 3.5 years, building up the platform, scaled from like 3 people to 25 people. And so, I mean, I can obviously keep going for forever. I don't know how far you want me to take my storytelling, but
I just like want to pause for a second because you're like, oh, I have a traditional path into where I am today. And you're like, and I started this startup in my dorm room, and then I worked at another startup that was acquired. And I'm not sure that that's the traditional path. And I think that's the very Bryan Healey path of doing all of these things and just like, all right, I'm going to keep going with it.
Fair. Yeah. Maybe traditional is the wrong word. I should have said more like I didn't career transition. I was just like straight into tech, like right out of the gate. But yeah, definitely probably not truly traditional from like what most people experience, which is just like get a degree, get the first job, and sort of march from there.
Well, and so you've always been involved in the startup life then. So it's been startup after startup. And then so at some point you transition from somebody else's startup to your own startup. So where is that happening?
Yeah, I mean, I'll quickly caveat that by saying that I didn't realize this was potentially unusual until I was older, but I've always had that bug in me. I think I was starting businesses when I was 8 years old. Like I was always been doing that kind of
8-year-old Bryan's business. Yeah. That's what I want to know.
So, well, like for instance, like a random story in that vein, but I'll only tell one of them. So when I was 10 years old, I started a lawn care service in the neighborhood, but I hired all of the neighborhood kids to work for me. And essentially and essentially got like about 30 houses in the neighborhood to sort of sign up for this like kids lawn service. And I would take cuts of everybody doing lawn care for
that's awesome. Where did you learn to do that or think that way?
I didn't
that early.
That's the weird thing. I just sort of like, I mean, I must have learned from somewhere, I guess, but I don't have a clear vision in my head of where. I mean, I probably just observed
Mark
like,
Twain.
just like observed other people doing things and you're like, I could do that. So yeah, that's what random aside. So the progression from how I got to college to my own startup, I won't tell the whole story because I've had a lot of gigs in my career. I think altogether, not eight gigs in total. But the gist of it is that I've sort of clung to the startup space in general, or at the very least, sort of like the innovation space. I've had a couple of tiny stints at bigger companies, but usually it was in a very specific capacity. So like I did a stint at Amazon in 2013 to 2016. But I joined specifically to work on the Echo Alexa project. And so it was a brand new division business. I was one of the first 50 hires. I got to sort of like play entrepreneur inside of a big beast. And that was its own kind of fun. Other than like random deviations like that, I've mostly been around startups, either helped try to found them or just joined very early. So like from the startup I joined in college, Garment Ballet, I jumped to another startup as the 6th hire called Shape Up, and was there from 6 people to I think about 75 people, something like that. Jumped from there to another startup. I sort of a later stage startup. I think I was like the 52nd hire, but it was another like that vein. They were like 4 years old. Whose name actually escapes me now. They were up in Waltham. And then from there, I actually tried to start a startup of my own. It was a company called Joinvestor. Essentially early days of like crowdfunding. I was trying to start up sort of like a Republic.co style company, trying to get people to sell their startup shares on an exchange using a very new regulation called, oh no, what was it called? Oh, that's going to bug me. There's actually a name for it. It's kind of a cool name, but it's been so long. It's like out of my head now. I ended up bringing on 2 co-founders while I was doing that. We raised a little bit of seed money and we sort of were talking to investors and sort of trying to get things going. We never quite got it up to like launch. There was all kinds of questions around the regulation. Is this going to last? There's a lot of opposition to it. Is it worth investing in? Getting companies to sign up was a challenge. Anyone who was of really high value would, of course, just go raise venture dollars. And so it was like getting quality deals to get the platform was a bit of a stretch. So that lingered for about 2 years, but never really took off. And it was from there that I jumped to another startup called Name Media. They were another one for like late stage startup. I think I was like the 60th employee and they were like 4 years old. It was like pre-IPO. And I was there through them getting acquired. And then from there, I jumped to Amazon. And so that's sort of where the next piece of it sort of takes off. So while I was at Amazon, I ended up getting recruited into being the AI director at a company called Lola, which is, if you know anything about kayak.com, was founded by this guy, Paul English. He's a big name in Boston. I'm not sure how far his sort of like presence reaches in the wider US tech community, but he's a big deal here. And so he co-founded Kayak. After he sold Kayak to Priceline, he started Lola as like sort of this new venture in conversational travel base. So like it was sort of like an automated travel agent from the original pitch. So you could have the experience of personalized travel agency without having to physically go anywhere or even talk to a real human. You could just do it through this digital experience. And so I joined there. Through that whole experience, I got connected with my current co-founder, Ken Senna. He was a senior at a company called Evercore, and then later Wells Fargo, as an analyst, which basically he's sort of a financial pro. He advises big funds and firms on how to invest their money. And through connecting with him, we ended up co-founding Era, which was sort of like this AI-enabled platform to help professional analysts do their job better and sort of make smarter decisions. Early days of Era, it was actually literally making predictions, trying to sort of like do the analyst job of writing research and sort of making recommendations. And it has evolved more into like a financial pros suite of services to help them do their job on the edges better, including the big centerpiece of ours is events. So we connect to earnings calls, conferences, things that investors care about and pay attention to and make decisions on. And we transcribe them and analyze them and make it easier for investors sort of like, that workflow.
Yeah, that's awesome. So throughout all of this experience, it sounds like you've got to play a lot of different roles, which seems really fun. And I'd love to know maybe like what your best experience was, or what were you most excited about doing throughout this period?
It's really hard to pick a favorite experience because it's more like there's been a suite of things that have all just been different in different ways. And I have highlights from all of them. So I could sort of give some of those top line highlights. I mean, like for instance, joining ShapeUp was a specific experience. So prior to ShapeUp, I had been in this other startup, but that other startup was more of a grind. Like I joined as the third employee. It took 3.5 years to get up to 27 employees. And then the 2008 recession killed the business. And so it's just like slow grinding process of like building a business, a much more like ground level, like functional business. They actually had like trucks and drivers, and it felt more like real world, if that makes sense. To joining ShapeUp was my first experience of like a rocket ship. Like I joined a company that sold digital products. So it was just an office and servers. I joined as the third employee, and in a year we hired 50 people. And then it was just like this insane curve. And while I was there, we raised a ton of money, and we hired a new CEO, a new CTO. And like, it was a fire hose of crazy every single day for the whole time I was there. And even after I left, I got to watch them. I stayed in touch with people, and they just kept rocketing. And eventually they got acquired for big dollars by Virgin Group. So that experience sort of, I think, colored a lot of the rest of my career. I'm like, oh, this is what I like. This is fun. I enjoy the intensity of it. You know, even things that might not even seem fun in the moment. Like we had a couple of stretches where we had product launches with deadlines, and I'm literally sleeping at the office for 24 hours a day for like 4 or 5 days in a row. And it's like in the moment, I might have hated that, but in hindsight, it's like that's an experience that like is hard to reproduce in a successful way. And so it sort of colored my realization that like me being around startups wasn't just a convenience. This is where I like to thrive. This, I've done the bigger company thing and internships, and like, this is the fun.
Yeah,
and then, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, it seems like so many different personality types. There's a fit for that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there are people that would thrive in that startup atmosphere. There are people that will thrive at something that's more like a 9 to 5. And this is the same things that we do pretty much every day. So it's really dependent on like who you are as a person.
Totally. Yeah, exactly. Right. And if it's possible, my advice to younger engineers is almost always to do a stint at each and sort of get that experience level. Sometimes people just know themselves well enough, and that's okay. If you truly are like, no, I know I would hate the 9 to 5, like clock in, clock out, do my job kind of thing, or vice versa, then that's good to know that. But if you have any sort of questioning, tech is somewhat unique in the world of work, and that it's very common and not at all judged to do like year or 2 year stints. So you can sort of do some stuff first and sort of build up a bit of a resume and build up a bit of an experience cache and be like, okay, I kind of know what I like. And
that's a really good point.
Target. Yeah.
I never thought about that idea that it's normal to move from place to place, especially after a year.
Yeah. You know, once you get to really senior level, you start rising to like director, VP, C-suite stuff. Now it becomes more like, well, we expect you to be stable. You're here as a leader. But when you're in the junior, mid, and even early senior levels, it's sort of like you're just a gun for hire in most places. So it's not judged or unusual if you're sort of jumping around. I think the only mark I ever see is sometimes people are like, I'd like to see at least a year,
Yeah.
So they can at least stick around for a couple projects and see some things through to production before they move on.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay. So kind of like along those lines, do you ever hit that burnout point though? Like, I feel like there's gotta be a point. Maybe it's not hours spent, but the energy's just not there. And you're like, why am I doing this anymore? Or have you just always found that like, okay, I've got momentum that's carrying me forward and I'm excited about this?
Yeah, I don't know if this is unusual. My suspicion is it is, but for some reason I do have like bottomless energy, and I always have. So I've never really experienced burnout in the classic way people describe burnout. I will say I've experienced things similar to burnout, and it's almost always oriented around how excited I am when things are going on. We've talked about this in other forums. I'm a strongly ADHD, been diagnosed as a child. And so I have that sort of like dopamine fixation of like, I need something to key me in. If you can latch that, then I'll go 24/7, 365 at full speed all the time. And I can just sustain that energy. As soon as I start to lose that though, I start to lose the ability to sort of maintain that just because of that connection problem in my brain. And so most times when I've experienced that, it usually just means I'm ready to move on. Like the company I'm at is no longer at a place where it's really engaging me. I'm sort of starting to work on side projects more than I'm working on my main project. And I'm ready for the next big challenge. So it hasn't happened to me much in my career, but the few times it's happened, that's been the result. It's like, okay, it's time for a next big thing that's going to excite me.
When you're, I have similar, like a similar situation going on. Yeah. But my question was, knowing that about yourself, did that enter in your decision-making process about starting a company now? So now you're like, co-founder of a company, and maybe it feels like you might be a little less like able to hop out, there. You know what I mean? And I was wondering if that entered in when you're thinking about it, and also like now that how long has Era been?
We're at Era, we're about 3.5 years now.
3.5 years. Yeah.
Yeah.
So like two parts of that question, I guess, before when you're thinking about it, and then now, does that thought ever like creep up or like how would you like approach that in this situation? Cause you're not anymore a gun for hire or whatever,
Yeah, for sure. It definitely changes that capacity to, if I ever did feel sort of like the urge to like move on, it would be considerably harder. but the sort of a caveat to that is, which is, this is my thing. And so like, I can kind of set the direction. And you know, it allows me to be more flexible than I'd be able to be in more traditional roles. And so like, there are still, of course, boundaries, self-imposed boundaries for like what the business is. And we can't pivot all the time, and we have investors, and you have to make good, smart decisions about how to run the business. But you know, my ability to contribute to the business has been able to be as flexible as necessary, both for my own ability to contribute and my ability to sort of empower the team to do what they need to do. And so, you know, my role has shifted over time from being like the primary full-time ML engineer working on a prediction product to being mostly a sales tool and business developer, to moving back into like more of the R&D style role, working on ML projects that aren't on the front burner of demand, but are important for like long-term value generation. And so being able to sort of like set my own vision and sort of work with the team, as opposed to like, here's your project, you're working on X, and, you know, as sort of influenced, I think, that balance a little bit. All that being said, it's worth caveating that, and this is somewhat funny to admit, almost all of my career from college to now has had a remarkably small amount of planning. It's mostly just been like, hey, that's exciting. Hey, that's interesting. And just sort of like moving where the wind is exciting.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
That also sounds very familiar to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And so I confess to say that I think very little of that was pre-thought. Like, oh, I should be careful here. It's a startup. Yeah, it's just more like,
Totally.
doing this now. Yeah, this is exciting.
Yeah, no, I there's a lot in like, you know, I don't do startups, but I've been just independent, you know, my whole career as well, you know, and I think that I find that a lot of people, especially people with ADHD that have been in the industry for a long time, I think gravitate towards these sort of situations where there's, you know, in control a little bit more of their own, I don't know, their own destiny.
For sure.
You know?
Yeah, a little more, just a little bit more in control of how you can direct your energy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's really important. Cool.
Sorry. Okay. So how did you decide like you were ready to start your own thing? Or was that, I mean, I imagine that can't be really impulsive, right? There's got to be some thought process. You brought on a co-founder.
Yeah.
Well, so there's genuinely kind of two answers to that, actually. The process by how I've moved into and out of startups of my own creation, I've attempted or successfully created my own startup like 4 times. I'd say 2 of those were genuine successes of some capacity. Every one of them kind of evolved the same way, including Era, which is that I've never really been anywhere that wasn't my company, where I wasn't working on lots of side projects. I'm the type that can't really sit still. So when I'm done my work for the day and I'm home, I'm working on something else. And the scaling effect is sort of in my mind. When am I almost doing 2 jobs? Like, when has it moved from like a 10-hour a week, like having fun side project, to like, this is a thing. And it's really showing traction and there's excitement around it. You know, building Era, there was a good 6-month period where I was still in my other job. But Era was consuming like lots of time. Like, I was doing like sales runs and going to New York and pitching, and like it was a meaningful thing that I had built entirely on the side. And so there is a decision point where you're like, I could probably just do this now. But that does genuinely just kind of appear. Like for me, it's always been just literally it's the day where I'm like, I should just be doing this. This is really what I'm enjoying doing. The rest of the thing is just paying bills and adding stuff to the bottom line. And so it's time to shift. But the process of getting there is very organic for me, at least. Like, I've always got another thing going that I'm excited about and want to see if it goes somewhere. And most of them peter out. Most of them don't go anywhere, but you just keep trying stuff. And the number, I've probably started projects of some kind that I thought might go somewhere 20, 25 times. Most of them go nowhere. They sort of languish, and then I close them down after a while. But
do you have any advice about like how to consider those projects that you know, that don't go anywhere? I've heard and also experienced, you know, some like people expressing, you know, shame or whatever about some side project that went nowhere. It's still there, and it's like that sort of thing. Like
Yeah.
and you seem, I'm asking because you seem like very comfortable and feel good about about the situation. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
I was like wondering how you approach that, like the I think people sometimes avoid starting side projects because they don't want to make something that it is going to fail, or for instance.
Yeah. I mean, the unfortunate answer is some of it I don't know how to answer other than just like don't be shameful. Like I know that that's a terrible thing to say. It's like telling somebody don't be sad, like. But like this is an element of that where I just never really felt a problem with that. I like to do stuff, and when things don't work out, I'm very failure comfortable, I guess is the way to describe it. Like
Yeah.
things that in fact, I almost have this. This might be almost a negative. I haven't quite decided in my own self analysis, but like when things don't work out, I'm really comfortable just going like, okay, and then never thinking about it again. It's like I can just completely move on once I've decided that something's not going to work. And like right up until that decision point, I will be doing like 110% to try to make something work. And it's like this weird mental thing I can do where I'm just like, okay, I've decided it won't work. And I move on.
I love that.
In terms of like, but other than that, potentially useless advice, the more practical advice I would give is really just around like perception thing. The only reason I could imagine to feel a problem with it is you're fearful of like outside perception. Like, does it look like I'm a failure?
Mhm.
I guess it could be internal.
Oh yeah, that's
I'm,
absolutely.
but I
I
now
feel like
kind of
you've
projecting a
called me
lot
out on
actually.
that, Bryan. I feel like personally attacked right now.
Like,
no, I don't feel like that. Stop it.
so it's like, so if it's an external validation concern, and I don't know if this is helpful or not, but in general, I would say nobody's going to judge you for that 100%. Like, and anyone who might is somebody who's weirdly thinking about things in a way I can't wrap my head around. Like, I don't monitor people's GitHub accounts. Like, oh, they deleted repo. Something's weird going on there. Like, nobody cares. This is not a thing. So like, and from a hirer, from like an employer perspective, I like seeing people that are tinkering and toying and creative. Like, ultimately, we're in a field that is a very mental, creative field. I want to see people who are sort of like out there, willing to take chances, willing to do experiments. It's a fundamental basis of experimentation is lots of your experiments prove your hypothesis wrong.
Yeah.
Like that's what you're looking for. If they all just proved it right, then they wouldn't, something's not right there.
I love that. And I want to pause for a minute just to make sure that we emphasize that. So, that idea of lost projects can be something where you can testify like, look, I am trying new things. I am getting creative. I want to push myself beyond these things. And I know when it's time to stop and move on to the next thing. And that's a really great way to reframe those experiences.
It's also worth saying that like, there's also nothing wrong with having ideas that linger. Like if you're working on something, but it doesn't yet have sort of like a clear niche and you're not taking off, but you're not ready to call it, that's fine too. Like things can just exist out there. I've done a small handful of those. Like I'll give you sort of one. It's not out there anymore, but I years and years and years ago, back in 2007, 8, God, long time ago at this point. Back in my PHP days, I wrote a framework in PHP called Helium because I'm egotistical. And
nice.
And it was just a standard MVC style framework, but I spent a ton of time like just sort of like pouring shit in there. But I had no idea what it was for. I just like did it to do it. And so I put a website up with it, threw up a GitHub, and I was actually it might not have been GitHub back then. It was SourceForge. SourceForge. Oh, can I swear? And it was just sort of like, okay, here's a thing I built. Maybe it'll be something interesting. Back then there were companies that were sort of cropping up that were just selling like frameworks. I was back in the very early Django days. The early, what was that PHP site? Anyway. But I didn't know what I was going to do with it. So like for a solid like 5-6 years, it was just a thing that existed that would update once a year when I got the motivation. And then finally I just was like, I think I'm the only one that's ever used this. It's just my thing basically. And I just didn't feel like maintaining it. So I took it down, and that's fine. It's just it was a toy that I wanted to see if it went somewhere. It didn't, and that's okay.
Yeah. I really love that. I think so. This is going to be a little bit of a tangent, but there was when I was first starting learning how to code, I went to this conference online, and one of the talks was about how to monetize your kids' hobbies. And I was like super kind of grossed out by that. Like, hey, why don't we just let kids have fun? But then as we move into adulthood, like that mentality, I think that exemplifies what the mentality of adulthood is, right? Like if you have a hobby, you better be making money off of it, right? And like why not just try some things out and see what happens with it, or
Oh yeah.
have fun with it, and not put all this extra pressure on yourself to be a startup founder or to build the new and best thing. Like you don't have to do that thing in all of your projects. Like sometimes it's just worth pursuing to see like what comes out of it.
Yep. It's sort of weird. Like in my experience, this is just anecdotal, but in my experience, the vast majority of successful founders really aren't people that set out to be founders. They're just people that do stuff. They just like to do stuff. It's just constantly
So
doing
all the
stuff.
ADHD people.
Yeah, all
I
the
know.
ADHD people. And it's just like I need something in front of my face that's taking up my attention. And they just end up, like I said, they fall into something lucrative. Like oh, this is a thing. We have a lot of users now. This is cool. And you can sort of lean into it and it sort of takes off. And that's okay. Like I agree with you. Like it doesn't have to be like, oh, how can I make money? Like how can I make money right now? What can I do to convert this? I mean, obviously money is an important part of life, you need a job and all that, but like your focus should really just be more on doing things. And I think it can be, even that's a little bit, I want to make sure I'm not being disingenuous, because like I've always wanted to found a company. I'm an entrepreneur mindset. It's more just like, how do those two mix together? My mindset is that, yes, I like being entrepreneurial and I want to take things somewhere, but it's like, I'm not going to a legal pad and going like, okay, what's my next business idea?
Right.
It's just more like in the back of my head, I know that's where I might take everything eventually. Like that's what I'm tinkering for. But in the moment, I'm just tinkering, and then we'll see what lands.
Yeah, I've talked to a number of people who are in like the more senior portion of their career in the past couple of months that have just felt, they've hit what we often refer to as burnout. And
Mhm.
I've said like, I think you're bored. Like this was interesting when
Yep.
you got started, and I see it all the time. Like it is interesting, and you push forward and you do these new things, and then at some point you stop doing all of the new things, right? It
Yep.
gets a little bit slower and you're working on the same things, and then it becomes hard. Like and honestly, like it's a place where a lot of people experience mental health issues, where they start to become depressed because they don't have that same like interest or like
Mhm.
that momentum forward that keeps them going. And then it just kind of like all that thing that you've invested so much time in that's given you energy is now like sucking all of that energy out. and
Yep.
and that's like, hey, it's time to move on. Like whether you don't have to find the perfect project, but
Right. It's just
find
time to
something
look.
that's better than what you're doing.
Totally. Yeah. And you can, you know, I always feel like a little bit, I'm not calling anyone out specifically, but I hear a lot of things when I go to younger engineer forums and discussion points of like, there's a lot of focus on like trying to plan your career. If that makes sense. Like, what's the next thing I should do? I'm looking at all these options. And if that's your personality type, that's great. I'm not going to discourage anyone to do what works for them. But in general, I'd say that there's nothing wrong too with quite literally being just like a rock in a pond. Like if you see something cool, go for it. Like there's really no like, oh, is this a bad career decision? I don't know. Do it anyway. You know, if you're working at a company, it's not making you thrilled, and you hear about a startup that's just doing something that intrigues you, pursue it. Maybe it doesn't go anywhere. Maybe you don't get the job. Maybe you get an offer. It's not good enough, but always be willing to take chances and just sort of put yourself out there and dive into things. I think that's the only way to, like you said, avoid that burnout where you don't feel like you're stuck to a thing. You can always move anytime you need to.
Do you ever find that, I mean, maybe personally and as a person that like hires people for the company, that you have someone on the team or you've been in this situation where it's very exciting initially and then very quickly they hit that like, oh, actually maybe this is not for me. And then what do you do in that situation, or what advice would you give?
Um, well, so there's probably two edges to that. What advice would I give as the employer trying to retain my talent? I would probably encourage them to pick up new projects internally that they might find more exciting. What things can we put them on that gets the motor moving. Um, from a mentor perspective, not outside there, I'd say that there's nothing wrong with making that realization quick and starting to look right away. I've done that before. I have at least one, maybe two. I'm trying to really think through my career now, but I know I had at least one like 6 month stint on my resume where I was like, nah, this isn't, I'm not enjoying this at all. It's time to move. And I really looked around. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think if you did that repeatedly, like 4, 5, 6 times in a row, after a while, it starts to look funny, but one or two or even three in a career, that happens. It's normal.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, that's such good advice. Like when we find so many people in that position all of the time and trying to figure out what they're doing. And a lot of it's the hang up on what it's going to look like on a resume.
Yeah. And like anything else, I'd say that it's sort of shitty to make this kind of advice, but like there does come a point where things like that get weird. Like I said, if there was 6 of those in a row, as an employer might go, ooh, they haven't had one year stint in the last, 6 jobs. That's a little weird. But like there's no magic number where it's like, oh, 4 is too much. Like it's really just an eyeball test of like how does it look? And in general, I'd say a few of those is not a problem. It never bothered me as an employer if I see like 1 or 2 of those. I might ask a question in the interview, just be like, hey, I know, you had a 6 month stint, what happened there? And all I'm ever looking for is just like, yeah, it just wasn't the right fit. The projects weren't as exciting as I thought. And we parted ways amicably, that kind of stuff. And they're like, okay. As long as they don't get the, oh yeah, I hated my boss kind of answer, then.
What if they do hate their boss? What if they have a terrible boss?
Well, this has nothing to do with what we were talking about, but just sort of like random career advice. Never say that, even if it's true, because nobody cares at all. It just makes it look like the wrong answer, even if it was the right answer. And I can't verify it as an employer. So it's always like, I don't want to share that one. Just lie to me. As an employer, just say it was a conflict of.
What if you don't have a good lying face? I feel like.
Well, yeah, I guess that's
turn my
covered.
camera off. I'm sorry, I'm having issues with my camera. No,
like,
it
I'm
was
gonna look
totally
this way while I answer this question.
I feel like you have a really good gut instinct for things. Would you agree with that?
I like to think I do. Who knows how true that is, but yeah, I think so. I mean,
what do you think? Like, I feel like this is a silly question. Can you develop a gut instinct?
I actually think yes. I just don't know how to teach it. I do think it's something that you can develop, but it's something you kind of have to develop on your own. It's because it kind of also depends on what we're talking about by gut instinct. So there's sort of a couple of different things that play in that. So like, I have a pretty good read for people in general. I think. And it comes with extreme risk for bias. So I always try to caveat it by looping in lots of other people. I'm never the final arbiter of this kind of stuff unless it's universally a positive. Like sometimes I have in the past taken a unilateral, like positive decision. Like I'm going to hire this person because I think they're great. I very rarely to almost never have taken unilateral, I'm not hiring this person because I don't like them. Like I always try to make sure that I'm mixing in people to sort of check me on those kinds of things. But separating that acknowledged concern for bias, I do think I have generally a good impression of people and sort of what I think they can do or excited to do, and sort of what, how they'll fit in certain roles. But then there's also like gut feeling for just general things, like career things, like, does this company look exciting? Do I think that the leadership that I am talking to actually sounds good or bad? And I guess that a little bit fits into the people analysis, but it's more like parallel versus directly in the same line. And so a lot of that, I think, just comes from experience. Like you can have a decent, like general intuition for it, but most of it you just learn through like, I've talked to 20 companies in my career, and these are the things I keep seeing in companies that burn out later. And these are the companies I keep seeing in companies who I remember and have good relationships with the founders with, and you sort of like start to develop that checklist of like what you're looking for when you're talking to potential employers or you're talking to potential employees.
So when is that Bryan Healey book coming out? That's a good one.
Yeah. So ironically, it probably is massively updating. So I wrote, like, I self-published a kind of silly book, but it was basically just a collection of old essays on these kind of topics, like years ago. That was like the kind of crap I see in startups repeatedly and I find interesting. And I've always wanted to do one on like people too, but that one's also a little bit riskier.
Well, no, we got to come up with a pseudonym for you for
Yeah, I know,
publishing.
right?
So it'll
Something
be,
nice.
yeah,
Something safe.
Ryan Feely.
It's a name. Is that a football player? Oh man, he's like my alternate ego.
I'm still thinking about the helium name for that PHP thing. It's
That was
amazing.
ironically, that was my nickname all through grade school.
Oh,
That was
nice.
helium. Yeah, that's where it came from.
That's fantastic. Okay, so through all of this and what you're working on in Era, you're doing a lot of machine learning stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so is that, there's been a lot of advancements, I guess, over the past even couple of years. And
Oh
like,
yeah.
how does that, do you think that like that's part of what's kept you interested? Like it keeps growing, it keeps changing. It's a fun field to be in. And like, but also it's overwhelming because there's so many changes. So how do you balance that? Like, this is cool versus like,
Yeah.
I don't even know where to start.
So machine learning is my favorite field of any career I've ever been near, specifically because it's lunatically fast paced. Like tech in general is fast paced.
Mhm.
Machine learning is insane. I can't even, I actually, I had a friend of mine talk about it. Like we should talk about machine learning engineers like wine vintages. Like, oh, that's a 2007 machine learning engineer. They know, Keras and because it's like rapidly you lose yourself. Like, oh, I haven't worked in Keras in 5 years. What's it worked on? Oh my God, look at all this stuff. They come with all these pre-built models. Like everything just always moving at such a pace that yes, it keeps it super exciting. It's a little stressful. You're like always trying to stay on the cutting edge and learning new things and keeping up on what's new. But I think you're right in that it hits that side of the brain that's like, I'm never bored. There's always something kind of neat going on in this space. And yeah, so I'd say that's pretty much the gist of there. And it's sort of funny. It also fits into the same medium that tech in general kind of fits for me, which is, I'm trying to think how to phrase this, but like machine learning makes me feel this especially, but really all of tech is that it's not really an industry in a classic sense. It's like oil. It's just there in everything. There's healthcare tech, there's legal tech, there's finance tech, there's, it fits into every vertical pretty much. And so it's not like I just sit and code for the sake of code. I'm always serving an industry of some kind. So I can go into any of these and sort of play. In my career, I have worked in health tech, I have worked in consumer tech, I've worked in retail, I've worked in voice assistance, I've worked in fintech, and I've worked in travel and actually more. And so like you just always get to sort of play in these different spaces. And so both tech and machine learning especially allow you to sort of like never get bored in a single space where you just like, I just know this head to toe and it's not driving the excitement anymore.
Yeah, I love that. And I've always felt the same way. It's another bonus of either moving jobs or being independent or all that stuff is like you get into a different job and all of a sudden it's a whole new domain to learn, right?
Yeah,
and you don't have to like I don't know. We work on I don't know, gas pressure valve, a company that makes those, right?
Yeah.
But I'm like writing JavaScript and stuff, but at the same time, I know a whole lot about gas pressure that I didn't before.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
that sounds like I wouldn't like
it's
say,
cool,
I'm
though.
gonna have to like change. Yeah, exactly. Like that's what I
Yeah.
mean. It's like you get to nerd out about something new all the time.
Totally.
Aside from the technology that you're actually like building.
And to your point, without having to make the commitment of being like,
right.
Oh, I have to change careers to learn X.
Right.
No,
Right. Right. Yeah. No, I'm not going back to school and becoming, some sort of mechanical engineer and learning about gas lines and stuff. But there is a certain amount of it that I have to learn just to do a good job, and I'm sure the same is with every single industry that you're in. It's like,
yeah,
it's just a new puzzle to like learn about.
Well, I think it's interesting too, because a lot of early career people or people who are coming into tech, the thing that you hear is, well, do you enjoy front end or do you enjoy back end? Which is really hard to tell because you've been working on these very basic understandings of all of the things. And so I don't think it gives a really good amount of experience. But you might really enjoy front end dev in one portion of an industry. Like maybe you love front end dev in healthcare stuff, but you hate front end dev in another sector of the industry. And
Mm-hmm.
I have never really thought about it broken down, but I think like even going back to Jesse's podcast from the beginning of the season where she talked about that guy who was talking about the sandwich shop or deli, right? Like he was interested in the deli, and so he built something. Jesse was interested in chess, and so she has framed everything along those lines. And so in the same way, if you feel bored in whatever industry you're working in, but you like front end dev or you want to give it a try, then maybe just try a different industry, and that might be more exciting to you.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot of, I'm trying to think how to phrase this. Like, I feel like I want to say this for career changes. This is probably even true for just young people in college. There's like a lot of this, I think, pressure to understand what you want to do instead of like marching into it. And so there's like this stress of like evaluating things like, oh, do I like front end? Do I like back end? Do I like machine learning? Do I like it? And my generalized advice in my career as it's progressed has always been like, don't do that. Just kind of do stuff. Genuinely, I know that sounds so weird, but like it's one of the few industries where you can do that. Like for the first several years of my career, I was a front end engineer. Anyone who's seen things I created know that was a bad decision. I have no front end skills whatsoever. I can't design anything, and yet there are 3-ish websites in the world that I designed. God help them. You can still find them on archive.org if you want to, and it's like that's okay. Like I fiddled in a space. I even got to get paid for it. And then I was like, this is really not going to work well for me in the long term. I should do something else. And I would experiment with data science. I would experiment with backend projects and server infrastructure and just keep doing things. And it's a big reason why I'm a big fan of early engineers being full stack. Just do stuff, like be willing to make APIs and front end designs and play, in API development and database architecture. It's also why I kind of advocate for young people to try a startup or two, because you're going to be in a space where that's just almost a forcing function. Like you're one of 5 people, you're going to do everything. You just have to.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And like, I'm glad you said that, because it's the kind of advice I've wanted to give as well. And I struggle giving it. I struggle like putting it into like phrasing it well, but that like, to stop worrying and just do the thing or whatever, like,
yeah,
jump in and build.
And I mean, I'll even admit, I mean, just for the sake of devil's advocate and be, admitting to the risk, there's downsides to that too. There's not a lot of like, there's not a lot of good mentorship in tech either because of that. Like there's not a lot of like, what's the word I'm looking for? There's not a lot of like apprenticeship paths in tech where you can like, I want to try this. I'm going to spend 2 years working with people and learning. It's more like, here's the thing, good luck, Yeah. And there's a lot of that in tech, and that can be a negative, but I, just because of my nature, I like to spin that as a positive, be like, yes, that can be stressful and it can have its downsides, but it also means that you have the flexibility to learn at your pace, to learn on your own, which is always fun and self-rewarding when you pull things off. And it means that you are never going to get yourself stuck in a path where you're like, crap, I've spent 5 years on this thing I don't like. Like, now what do? I can't just pivot now. Yeah, you can just keep moving and see find things you like. And tech is an industry that uniquely affords that without much downside risk.
Yeah, I love that. And it's so true. And I wanted to call out that advice of that you dropped a minute ago about having when your early career, like joining a small team, where you're going to get that, there's probably going to be a little more pressure on you and maybe a little less, structure to support you, maybe,
Yeah.
But the bonuses of it are so large, right? And you get exposure across like a whole like a large amount of space, right? And you're going to end up maybe you're going to end up doing some database work and also some front end, React work or PHP or whatever it is, like whatever they need, right? Because that's what they need. And if you can, trust the organization to be okay with you learning on the job, then like that's the best way to get all the experience. I think that's great advice.
And it's sort of like there's sort of an interesting addendum to that has an element of risk to it. I'll admit, like obviously it sucks when you fail, and that happens sometimes. And I'll always coach people to be like, that's okay. It really is. I promise.
Mm.
You should learn from that. The same token, by taking the risk where you might fail, those times where you do get thrown the deep end, thrash around and learn to swim, feel like heaven. Like,
Yeah.
I conquered this. This is my thing. Look what I just did. That's a great feeling. And there's not many places where you get to experience that so often.
I love that. And yeah, that is the thing that happens all the time in tech. And, in small ways and big ways, it's like even just squashing that bug that was driving you crazy for a couple hours or whatever, a couple days, that feeling, vanquishing it,
Exactly.
it's like
Exactly.
such a good feeling. And, that can scale all the way up to career challenges and all that stuff. I love that.
Yep, for sure.
Yeah, and I think that's, one of the biggest takeaways that anybody can have from what they're doing, especially early career people. There's just this focus on failure for whatever reason,
Mhm.
and like really flipping it on its head. It's not a failure. So what is it? Like, how else can you reframe how you're thinking about this job experience? What have you gained from this?
Yeah.
And really like kind of addressing like, okay, well, like maybe it's just I learned where my limits are. I learned that I will not let people treat me like this in a job situation. Or maybe it's I learned that I should ask for help sooner, or anything.
Yep.
But thinking about what you've learned and doing that self-evaluation is not something that we talk about often, but I think that it can help combat a lot of the problems that we see with early career people who leave the field, even people who are interviewing, right? Because it's really hard to interview if you are
Mhm.
interviewing for a junior level position. There's a lot of people interviewing for junior level positions right now. And to get turned down, it's not a failure. Think about what you've learned. Think about
Yeah.
how you can take that moving forward and keep using that, build on that.
Yep. Totally.
Well, this has been a really great conversation, Bryan. But we are just about out of time. So is there any last tips that you have for our listeners, whether about career or startup life?
Oh boy. I mean, that's dangerous. I could probably talk forever. I mean, I guess the last tip, also to piggyback on something you were just saying, I think it's worth addressing. I've said it before in different contexts, but I'll say it again, which is like, especially with things like interviewing, remember that that's its own skill. And to extrapolate that a little further, most of the things in this space are their own skills. And it's almost a problem that we lump them in with the word tech. It's like saying medicine. Like, a surgeon is very different from a nurse, is very different. Like, there's a series of skills in the space. And so, to your point, struggling with any one of those at any one time, even, getting better at it and struggling again, none of this really means anything about you as a person. Doesn't mean anything about your career path. It's its own skill that might need a little workout once in a while. Like, interviewing is its own skill. It's a hard skill. You might get good at it, and then it might go 5-6 years before you're interviewing again, and now you're rusty. Like, that's also fine. Like, just always give yourself grace in the space of being like, you're not failing. You're just sort of like working muscles as you go. And sometimes those muscles take longer to develop. Sometimes you develop them and let them atrophy. That's also fine. You can redevelop them. Like, just let yourself grow at your own pace, and just be willing to your point, just take lessons from things that don't work out and keep moving.
Yeah, that's awesome. And for those of you who don't know, Bryan is very, very strong as well. So I'm gonna keep going with this analogy here, because I think like there's some days you go to the gym, right, and you can lift that heavy weight, and 2 days later you go back there and you can't lift it, and you're like,
Oh yeah.
what has happened, right? But
Yeah. Like,
there are like
what's like,
a number of conditions that can happen that you just can't hit it that day, even though it was easy 2 days ago. It's
yep,
like it's exactly what you're saying about interviewing.
totally. And I mean, I'll even extend that further to something which I'd really like. I have intense ADHD, so my focus is all over the place. There are some days where I'm locked in and I'm writing code and working and managing, and everything is sort of running smooth. And then I'll have 2-week-long stretches where I'm just kind of like, fit a little bit, And
For
it's
the listeners, Bryan is sitting there with his hand,
just sort of like,
head in his
slouching.
hand, just looking
yeah,
around.
just sort of like looking into space. And it's like, and it, I don't know why I have always been able to, all the way back to school days, I've always been able to just be comfortable with that. Like,
Mhm.
everyone else, I've had this very sort of, be a little vulgar for a moment. I always joke that I have a very Boston you attitude about life. Like, I worry about my thing, worry about your thing, we're all gonna be fine, you know. And so I've always been very comfortable with the fact that like that happens to me sometimes. And it's like, well, next 2 weeks, I'm just gonna drink some coffee and try to muddle through. But I know a lot of people struggle with that. And so like my advice generally is that try as best you can, whether that's through your own self-coaching, whether that's through outside mentorship or even therapy or whatever things need to get you there, to like be comfortable with your own unique way of managing yourself and your life. Not everybody is going to be in the same boat. And that's okay. And you just sort of like learn strategies and learn methods to sort of do your own thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Such great advice. Bryan, this has been a great conversation. And if anyone has not met Bryan, you're missing out, because Bryan always has great advice and hot takes for days. So very much have enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks,
you.
Bryan. It was a lot of fun.
All right. Well, we'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Sounds good. Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Virtual Coffee Podcast. This episode was produced by Dan Ott and Bekah Weigel and was edited by Andy Bonjour at Good Day Communications. If you have questions or comments, you can hit us up on Twitter at virtualcoffee.io or email us at podcast@virtualcoffee.io. You can find the show notes, sign up for our newsletter, check out any of our other resources on our website at virtualcoffee.io. And of course, join us for our virtual coffee chats every Tuesday at 9 a.m. Eastern and Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern. Please subscribe to our podcast and be sure to leave us a review. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.